John Lindahl. I'd like to welcome you to the Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag Lecture Series, held here at the Museum of Nebraska History on the third Thursday of every month. A detailed schedule for this series, as well as information about all the Historical Society's programs and services, can be found on our website, which is nebraskahistory.org. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for funding the filming of these lectures. Their financial support allows us to tape and broadcast these programs on public access television. Today's speaker is Deb Arenz. She's the Senior Museum Curator for the Nebraska State Historical Society. She's going to talk about some of the treasures from the collections of the Nebraska State Historical Society. Deb Arenz.
Well, hello. As John said, I'm Deb, and I'm going to talk about some of the treasures in our collections. For those of you who are familiar with our Brown Bag series, we've been doing this every December for probably about 5 or 6 years, and usually we have a rotating crew of curators, but this year I wasn't quick enough in getting anybody to help me, so I'm here by myself, and hopefully I have some good stuff to show you. The name of my talk is Treasures from the Collections, but I think that's a little bit of a misnomer. Treasures is a loaded term, I think. Everybody's view of treasure is different. A lot of people get in mind something we dig up from the bottom of the sea and is worth lots of money. And obviously my version of a treasure is different than yours. My kids' toys are treasures to me, but they don't mean anything to anybody else. And what the Nebraska State Historical Society collects doesn't always equate to monetary treasure, but it's a treasure that we think tells a great story about Nebraska history or mean a lot to the people of Nebraska. And also, because it's December and we try to approach this talk with a little bit of fun, I just sort of pick stuff that I like. So I actually renamed the talk to Cool Stuff That Deb Likes. So this is cool stuff in our collection that I like, and generally I try to pick stuff that isn't on exhibit a lot or permanently. And our first image is of Abraham Lincoln. So Deb likes Abraham Lincoln. This is a campaign portrait of Abraham Lincoln that was taken in Springfield, Illinois on or near May 24th, 1860. Just a few days after his nomination as the Republican candidate for president. The ambrotype is believed to have been taken by William Marsh, and it was donated to the Society by Miss Charlotte Ward in 1856, and it originally belonged to Frank Baldwin, the donor's uncle, a businessman, publisher, and friend of Lincoln. The ambrotype passed to the donor's father, Dr. Henry Baldwin Ward, who was dean of the University of Nebraska Medical School in the early 1900s. Ambrotypes are negatives produced directly onto glass that become positives when mounted against a black backing. Copies are not possible because the negative is the finished print. Therefore, this is truly a one-of-a-kind image of Lincoln. We have one other Lincoln piece here. This is a bronze cast of a life mask of Abraham Lincoln that was taken by artist Leonard Volk in 1860. In 1886, a committee was formed to purchase the original casts and present them, along with bronze copies, to the National Museum in Washington. Additional bronze copies were presented to the committee members, and this copy was a gift to General John Pershing in 1920 from Douglas Volk, who was a son of the artist. Okay, so the object I'm talking about is that chest of drawers right there, and this is a pretty recent acquisition for us within the last year. And this desk belonged to A.L. Green, who was born in Pennsylvania in 1845, and is sitting next to his bride in that photo. In 1869, President Grant adopted the policy of putting the administration of Indian reservations into the hands of members of the Society of Friends, or Quakers. Green, who was a Quaker, was appointed agent to the Oto tribe, whose home was in Gage County near where the town of Barnston now stands. As Indian agent, Green acted as peacemaker between tribes, arbiter of differences between individuals within the tribe, and also as a representative of the U.S. government. Green's term as agent ended in 1872, and he was given the choice to continue as agent with the Oto tribe or accept the same position with the Winnebagos. Instead, Green and his wife chose to move to the young town of Beatrice with his new daughter. Green and his wife, the former Sally Cadwallader Lightfoot, who is seated next to him, raised 4 children in Beatrice. He remained a resident of Beatrice, working in real estate until his death in 1947. In addition to the collection in the museum, which includes family furniture and also a lot of Native American objects, which many are actually on exhibit in our First Nebraskans exhibition, the library archives has a lot of addition to that, there are several really charming children's books that he wrote and illustrated for his children and grandchildren. And actually, you can access some of those images on our website, which is nebraskahistory.org. He was really a great illustrator. And this is the first of two firearms that I'm going to show you. There's a plaque on this rifle that reads, "This gun was carried by Joseph D. Gilman, Fall City, Nebraska, enlisted October 15, 1861, in Company E, 2nd Regiment, Berdan's Sharpshooters." Gilman was born in Vermont in 1841. After attending public schools in Vermont, he studied law at Syracuse University, but enlisted in the Berdan's Sharpshooters of Vermont before he finished his degree. In late 1865, he came to Nebraska City, where he entered the law office of T.B. Stevenson and continued his studies. In 1868, he was admitted to move to Falls City to practice law. He represented his county in the Nebraska legislature of 1876 and died in 1926. Now, Berdan's Sharpshooters were organized in 1861 by Hiram Berdan, who was one of the top riflemen in the country at the time, and he sent agents all over the North to find other sharpshooters who could be put into units. The men were offered special benefits for participation, including a Sharps breech-loading rifle, extra pay, and the avoidance of battle duty. However, the only actual special benefit they got was the Sharps rifle. This, however, is a Colt Model 1855 revolving rifle and was issued to the sharpshooters prior to the Sharps. But many of the soldiers, especially those in the 2nd Regiment, actually preferred these to the Sharps and continued to use them. And our next rifle is a really interesting piece that we also got within about the last 2 years. And this is a Winchester Model 1876 Deluxe sporting rifle, which in and of itself is a great firearm and to many gun collectors would be considered a treasure. But what's special about it to us is it's engraved on its cartridge lifter with Judge E.S. Dundee, Falls City, Nebraska. And Judge Dundee was the presiding judge in the trial of the Ponca leader Standing Bear and made the landmark ruling that they were people under the law. Winchester records actually indicate that this rifle was shipped from the warehouse on April 10, 1879, 20 days before the start of the trial. What's also kind of fun story about this rifle is Laura Mooney, who is the museum registrar and my colleague, and I work with a really neat man named Dick Harmon, who is a friend and a volunteer for our department. And he's a locally well-known gun collector and expert. And he scopes out gun shows for us, which is really nice because we don't go to gun shows, but he finds us great stuff. And so we were chatting with him one day, and he just happened to mention that he was at a gun show and someone had this gun, and it had a Nebraska guy on it, but he didn't know who. I think it was Dundee. And Laura and I went, "What? Dundee?" And so we sort of were able to put together, and he didn't know the Nebraska history connection. We knew the Nebraska history connection, and we're able to use our forces for good and achieve it for the collection. So a good example of minds working together to get something done. This is not the prettiest artifact in the collection, but it's actually quite interesting. It's an M1 vehicle detector, and it's from the first automatic driving demonstration in the United States, which took place in Lincoln in 1957. And we have all of the parts. This is just one piece. The Electronic Automatic Driving Project was undertaken by the Nebraska Department of Roads and RCA Laboratories. The equipment used in the project was designed by Leland Hancock of the Nebraska Department of Roads with help from RCA. The end goal of the project was to develop an auto driving feature in cars and highways that could take over a car in an emergency. Although electronic automatic driving never took hold, technology from this project evolved into the technology that is now used to detect vehicles in roadway settings. And what I'm going to show you now is actually film footage from our archives from KOLN, and it's from the morning of the test. And it took place at Highway 2 and South 14th, right sort of south of the Department of Roads. So hopefully it will run. There it goes. So here he appears to just be explaining how it will work to the legislature. And there they are. There are actually wires in the asphalt on the road, and it somehow connected to the machinery within the vehicle. So they've taped over the driver. I always think I can see his hand on the wheel there. I think he's cheating, but. I was pretty surprised to find out this happened in Lincoln. I thought it was a really neat story. Yeah. Those are big, sturdy cars. There's not going to be any. Buddy, stop. I love these more contemporary items that we're getting into the museum now, because so often we have great pictures or moving images to go along with it. Really adds. Obviously, that artifact on its own doesn't tell much of a story, but along with that, it sure does. Okay, so this is a baseball, and it was signed by members of the 1928 St. Louis Cardinals baseball team, and it includes the signatures of two Nebraska baseball greats, Clarence Mitchell and Grover Cleveland Alexander. The Cardinals were National League Championship champions that year, but lost to the New York Yankees in the World Series. Mitchell was born in 1891 in Franklin County, Nebraska, and Alexander was born in 1887 in Elba, Nebraska, and both pitched in Game 2 of the series. And I wanted to show you guys images of these two, and I didn't have any readily available, so I Googled them, and I came up with this fabulous image, which has Clarence right there, and Grover is up on the top towards the right. And unfortunately, it was one of those expired eBay pages, so it was available, but no longer to us, so we'll have to look out for that one. Okay, this doll is a representation of Minnie Freeman, and Minnie Freeman was a teacher in a sod house near Ord when the blizzard of 1888 hit. She and 13 students stayed inside until the roof blew off, which at that point she had her students hold each other's hands, and she wrapped their hands together so they wouldn't come apart, and she brought them to safety about a mile away from the school. This doll was made in 1943 as part of a collection of dolls of Nebraska women educators put together by Delta Kappa Gamma, which is an honorary society of women educators. And the dress is patterned after Freeman's 1890 wedding dress and is actually made of material from her dress that she supplied to the doll maker. Freeman also inspired this song, 13 Were Saved, and I wanted to mention that there's a really neat book called The Children's Blizzard, which is about the blizzard of 1888, and I think it's for sale in our gift shop. So that would be my Christmas plug there. Okay, in our collection is this tintype of Ruth Cox, and she was born a slave on December 18th, 1818 in Talbot County, Maryland. She escaped from slavery at around the age of 21, and at approximately the same time, she attended a meeting held by Frederick Douglass, who is to the right. It's told that upon seeing Ruth, Frederick actually thought she was his long-lost sister. He quickly realized that she wasn't, though he asked her to come and live with him, with his family in Lynn, Massachusetts. Ruth lived with the Douglass family as an adopted sister for a number of years, helping Frederick's wife Anna with the children and with correspondence because Ruth was literate and Anna was not. When Frederick was away, he would send letters to Ruth for her to read to Anna, but he would also send letters to Ruth herself. In 1847, Ruth married Perry Francis Adams, and they had 3 children. In 1884, after the death of her husband, Ruth moved to Nebraska with her daughter and son-in-law. Although they lost touch over the years, Frederick never forgot Ruth, and later in his life began to search for her. In the early 1890s, he found word of her in a Norfolk, Nebraska newspaper, which noted that the Vandersea family had left their farm, and that's her son-in-law's family, and moved to Lincoln. And I'd also like to note that that's the same family that produced the Harlem Renaissance photographer, James Vandersea. In 1893, Frederick traveled to Nebraska to look for her but was unsuccessful. Soon thereafter, he regained contact with her by letter, and they corresponded until his death in 1894. Ruth died in 1900 in Lincoln and is buried at Wyuka Cemetery. So we have the tintype, and we also have this box. And this box was sent to Ruth from Frederick while he was in Ireland. And there's an 1847 letter, I think in the Library of Congress, that mentions this box. And it's postmarked in Belfast, and describes the beautiful work box he bought for her in London. And what's kind of neat about this box, when we got it, which was about 5 years ago, is inside of it, and I don't have pictures of that, there were locks of hair from everybody in the Douglas family, including Frederick. There were small mementos, there were little notes. So it's just this fabulous little container of history. Okay. These items came to Nebraska in 1949 on the Mercy train, or more officially known as the Gratitude train, and it's actually in French, but my French is horrible, so I'm not going to attempt to say it. The train had 49 cars, one for each state and one for D.C. and Hawaii to share, and all of the cars were filled with gifts from the French people, mostly from their own homes. The State Historical Society was one of the state repositories for the items, keeping 250 of the 1,000 gifts. And it was also in charge of receiving and distributing them throughout the state. And these are pictures of the cars in France. The Mercy train was a way for the people of France to thank the Americans who in 1947 sent over a friendship train with $40 million in relief supplies, and it was initiated by a Washington columnist and financed by contributions of Americans. The boxcar was built sometime between 1872 and 1885, and it was known in the French for 40 men, 8 horses, and that was the cargo they were originally designed to carry. The state turned the Nebraska boxcar over to the 40 and 8, which was an organization of doughboys who rode in such cars in World War I, and members of the group paid to have it moved to the state fairgrounds. Unfortunately, it was vandalized there and fell into disrepair and eventually was just sold for scrap. So a lost gem. But we have lots of these really neat little things. Here's 2 more. Just these sort of personal items from people's homes. Sometimes there's a lot of linens and handmade things. It's a great story and a great little collection. And we actually have a volunteer now who's going through and cataloging and photographing all of it for us. Okay, the camera is in our collection, and it belonged to this gentleman, John Anderson. Anderson began his career as a commissioned civilian photographer for the U.S. Army at Fort Niobrara, Nebraska, about 1885. He assisted photographing the 1889 Crook Treaty Commission with the Lakota Sioux, and is best known for his dramatic portraits of the Brule Lakota at Rosebud Reservation, which is located just north of the state line near Valentine. He was a prolific photographer, and there are more than 350 glass plate negatives in the Society's collections, which is over in our library archives. I'm just going to show you a small sample of his work. This is 4 generations of Two Strikes family from about 1906. This is Chief Stranger Horse from the Butte Creek district of the Rosebud Reservation, about 1900. Chief Two Strike, about 1896. And Stand and Looks Back, who was an Oglala Sioux from the Butte Creek district, also from Rosebud, about 1900. So some really wonderful images that you may have encountered before in other circumstances. I think they're quite well known. Okay, I'm going to spend a little time on some quilts. Some I have a lot of information about, and some of them not so much, but I just think they're great, and so I'm showing them. This is a quilt we just recently got and was on exhibit for a short period of time as a recent acquisition. And it was made for this lovely woman, Sierra. It was made for her, and her name was Sierra Nevada Bunnell. She was more commonly called Veda. She was born in Ashland, Nebraska in 1870, and the family legend has it that her father took a covered wagon load of freight to the west and was so impressed by the beauty of the mountains there that he named her Sierra Nevada. Sierra's father was Theodore Armstrong Bunnell and was a medical doctor and was elected to the Nebraska legislature as a Greenback Party representative. Sierra was educated in Nebraska and Illinois, and she joined the faculty of the Lincoln Business College in 1890 or 91, and she taught stenography and typing. The Lincoln Business College was a predecessor to the Lincoln School of Commerce, which was Hamilton and now is, I think, changed names again, might be Kaplan University. This quilt was actually made by some of her students in 1892 when she decided to marry and move to Kansas. Almost every block is signed, and the picture shown in the center features college faculty at the time, including Sierra. With her husband, Asa Smith, Sierra lived the rest of her life in Kansas and died in 1933. I think it's interesting because one of the new trends, I think, with quilt making is to have photographs actually printed onto textile, and here we're sort of doing the same thing, but in a different fashion. It's really an amazing quilt, and the slide doesn't do it any justice. This is a quilt that I just really like. It's a Baltimore album quilt. It was hand-stitched by the donor's great-aunt, N. Lohman. We haven't determined her first name at this point. And her family came to Baltimore from Munich in the 1850s. The quilt was made prior to 1858 and eventually came to Nebraska with her sister, who moved there after her marriage. The quilt stayed in the family until it was given to us in 1960. Many of the earlier quilts in our collection don't have the sort of Nebraska history that we sometimes look for in our collections now that we're acquiring. They were brought to Nebraska, but that's part of Nebraska's history too, is people moving here and bringing their precious items with them. This is a quilt that I just really like. It's maybe not one of our more beautiful quilts, but there's a lot of memories and history put into it. It commemorates the centennial of the Nebraska State Fair, and it was made by Hazel Myers, and she entered quilts in the fair from 1957 to 1969. She appliqued ribbons she won into the quilt, which is the 38th quilt she made. Each large yellow block depicts fair progress by decade, and the quilt also features scenes of her children participating in 4-H fair events. And I just really, to me it looks like she put a lot of effort into it, and I think it was very important to her and her family. We've had family members come view it, and I just like the idea of putting your history and your memory and your feelings into a piece of fabric and preserving it and then giving it to us so we can show it with everybody else. Which also ties in great with another exhibit we have coming up, which I won't plug that yet because I don't know the title of it. But we have a great exhibit coming up about preserving memories for the future. This is a neat little quilt. It's actually quite small. It's only maybe about that big. We call it the Century of Progress quilt because it's named that. It's made from wool produced on Katie Mays' parents' farm in central Indiana in 1849. The fabric was woven by her mother, and Katie began making the quilt in 1933 at the age of 72. This quilt was shown at the Chicago Century of Progress Fair in 1933 and the Nebraska State Fair in 1938, where it took the second prize. It depicts the life of her parents around the border with the embroidered scenes. Katie and her husband Matthew moved to Custer County, Nebraska in 1883 and lived in a sod house near Callaway until Matthew entered the ministry in 1888. He served with the Evangelical United Brethren Church in Nebraska, Iowa, and Pennsylvania, but the couple returned to Nebraska after his retirement in 1934. This is just a wonderful crazy quilt. We have a lot of wonderful crazy quilts in our collection. Some are strikingly beautiful and some are horribly garish, but still have great stories, so they're part of the Nebraska State Historical Society collection. This quilt was made by Clarissa Palmer Griswold in 1886. In 1885, Clarissa filed a preemption and a tree claim on land in Sioux County, Nebraska, and moved into her cabin in 1886. She drew inspiration from wildflowers she found on her claim, and she painted the flowers found on this crazy quilt. And she wrote, "That first summer I copied these flowers with oil paints on silk and velvet pieces sent me from home. The crazy quilt I decorated in piece then is now quite a showpiece to be handed down." And Clarissa was the mother of the future Nebraska governor and U.S. Senator Dwight Griswold. I should mention we have a crazy quilt exhibit opening in 2008, so crazy quilts have been on my mind. This is another crazy quilt that we don't know too much about, but I think is just gorgeous, and to see it up close, it's even more impressive. This was made by Jenny Ferguson sometime in the late 1800s at Aurora. The Fergusons came to Nebraska from Illinois in 1870 and were in the banking business there for 3 generations. And I hope to include this in our crazy quilt exhibit, so hopefully I'll learn a little bit more about the maker by then. This is a political quilt. In 1892, a third political party was organized known as the Independent or Populist Party. Some ladies of Blaine Township in Kearney County organized the Ladies Independent Club Pioneer No. 1 to raise campaign funds for the party. They made this double Irish chain quilt, and they raised money by selling opportunities to win the quilt for 25 cents. So eventually they raised $50, which is quite a lot. The independent candidates were largely unsuccessful that year, but in 1895 won seats in Congress and elected Nebraska Governor Silas Holcomb. And there are some candidates that are inked into this quilt as well. another really great example of sort of quilts and fabric telling a story other than just a utilitarian bed cover. This is a quilt that I love. We don't have any other quilt like this in the collection, and it's just really wonderfully made, and I love the large flag pattern. We don't know who made it. We have it because it belonged to General Pershing, who instructed military cadets at the University of Nebraska from 1891 to 1895. He was the commander of the American Expeditionary Forces in Europe during World War I, and we believe this flag dates from about that time. Okay, I think this is our last quilt. Another great example of the histories and memories woven into fabric. This was made by Ethel Cushing, and she used ribbons that she and her husband Lauren won at the Adams, Nuckolls, Clay, and Garfield County fairs between 1924 and 1931. And the prizes were for needleworking, canning, poultry, and livestock. And I just love this. There's something about it visually that's really striking to me, and the way she's put the ribbons on there is really unique, so I'm glad to show it. I'm sure she'd be glad that I was showing it. This is a painting by William Henry Jackson. Jackson was born in Keysville, New York in 1843. He was trained as an artist and served in the Civil War with the 12th Vermont Volunteer Infantry. In 1866, he journeyed west and was hired as a bull whacker with an ox train, hauling freight across the plains from Nebraska City to Salt Lake City. His field sketches formed the basis for paintings such as this one, which Jackson completed in the late 1800s to early 1880s to 1890s. It shows freight wagons fording the South Platte River on June 25, 1866. From 1867 to 1869, Jackson operated a photography studio in Omaha. In 1870, he joined the Hayden Geological Survey and became among the first to photograph the West's natural wonders, including Yellowstone. Jackson's sketches, paintings, and photographs vividly capture the trail experience and the glorious landscapes of the 19th century American West. He died in 1942. Okay, I'm going to show you a collection now of posters, and they're World War II posters. There's one over there on the right. And they were collected by Addison E. Sheldon. This is the best picture I get, and that is him in the upper right supervising the work of the State Historical Society staff, because he was the superintendent of the Nebraska State Historical Society from 1917 to 1943. I think the only thing we need is to draw in like a little bullwhip, and then that would be the perfect picture. Although I'm sure he was a very great man. As superintendent, Sheldon emphasized collecting current materials with an emphasis on the daily lives of ordinary Nebraskans. He realized that many incidents had passed without sufficient record and was prompted to collect material to document contemporary events. One of his first projects upon becoming superintendent was to visit battlefields in France during the fall of 1918 as a press correspondent. He talked with Nebraskans serving on the front lines and returned with banners, uniforms, shell casings, and other artifacts. He also gathered a large collection of posters that were hung in and around Lincoln during World War I and during World War II. In all, Sheldon collected 611 posters from both wars, and I'm going to show you a sampling of them. What I love about these is we know they were actually hung in Lincoln, and occasionally we even know where they were hung. So I think that's a really neat documentation. This is actually a handmade local banner, and from Lincoln. It's specific to Lincoln, and honestly, the majority of the posters in our collection are not specific to Lincoln. They're the posters that were distributed nationally. But I wanted to show you that we do have a few like this. Posters were considered a very easy, inexpensive, and accessible way for the government to get out their themes during both world wars, and usually of sacrifice and various other wartime themes that we'll explore a little bit in a few minutes. These are two posters from early in the war years. Their design trends a little bit more towards fine art and design, and they're somewhat more subtle than some of the later posters. The later posters had more of an illustration and ad feel, and a lot of times their messages were really in your face. Early in the war, a lot of fine artists produced posters for the war effort, and the poster on the bottom there is by Jean Carlu, who was a famous artist in his own right. Also, many of the early war posters were very text-heavy. Eventually, government officials turned away from these sorts of posters because they felt that it's too long for people to read them. They didn't get the message across quickly enough, and they were just too cumbersome. So posters such as this one were abandoned. Not totally, but primarily. This poster and the next few I'm going to show you encourage saving and the purchase of war bonds, which is a very popular poster theme. You can also sort of see the change from the earlier posters. There's just more of an ad sort of feel to them. And they get their point across very quickly and very simply. And you start to see the use of guilt. Guilt was a pretty big selling point on these war posters. And so this is one of our examples. You can, these I think are also not very much text, obviously done by wonderful illustrators, easy to read, easy to get the point across. That one too. I just love that one. He's coming for Japan. Another very common message in war posters was to limit the amount of information spread by common folks who were in the know. Many posters urged the viewers to keep their lips zipped and to keep any information about military endeavors to themselves. These first two posters are pretty graphic in their representation of what might happen if you don't keep your words to yourself. By 1944 and 45, the government had decided that these types of posters, posters of Americans being killed or posters of Americans actually killing, were not successful. They weren't working. So they kind of abandoned these graphic images of violence by about 1944. Here's another one about loose lips. I think that's a great poster. This poster, I think, is a good opportunity to bring up another interesting fact. In 1942, the National Advisory Council on Government Posters was formed. It was composed of ad agency art directors to inform the Office of Facts and Figures, which was the precursor to the Office of War Information. They did viewer reaction surveys in Canada with posters that had already been produced and mock-ups of posters to see what sort of reaction the Canadians were having and what the visceral reaction was to these things. And they came up with guidelines for posters. And one of the main guidelines was to design down to the lowest level of the population's comprehension, and they called that the lower third. So bye-bye posters by fine artists. Pictures were more effective than words, so there's significantly fewer words in a lot of these later posters, and that the pictures usually had to relate to objects that the average American or the lower third American could somehow relate to. So I'll let you decide how this relates to Americans and what sort of reaction it would get from them. This is another popular sacrifice theme during World War II, the need to limit travel. In 1942, the Office of War Information was formed and charged with the review, approval, and distribution of all posters. The OWI eventually came up with 6 propaganda themes for the posters. There was the nature of the enemy, which would obviously be very unfavorable, the nature of our allies, which would be very favorable, the need to work so that we could win the war at home, the need to fight, the need to sacrifice, and the need to be patriotic and supportive of the war effort. Early in the war, a lot of times artists could actually submit their work to the government for approval, but later in the war it had to go through this process, and even later in the war there were actually people working for the government specifically just to do this. Here's some more examples. And then obviously scrap drives. There was lots of posters for scrap drives. I love this one because I think this uses guilt really well. I mean, I don't know how you could refuse this person. These 2 posters are actually produced by industry, and eventually many corporations and large industry groups got into the business of poster production and distribution. Sometimes they did it to tout their own horns to the public, as I think the American Railroads poster does, or to encourage worker discipline, which the poster to the right does. Some of the posters really attempted to turn employees into production soldiers, equating the work that they were doing at home with the work of the soldiers on the battlefields. Union and labor groups also produced their own posters, equating wartime production success with the workers and not necessarily industry. And this is interesting because it reflects what was going on in the larger society before the war, where there was a lot of labor and management unrest. It was sort of squashed during the war where people were working together, but then it rose right back up after the war ended. And here are three of the 4 extremely famous posters done by Norman Rockwell. And I'm including them because I think it's interesting that when Rockwell did these, they were actually rejected by the government. They didn't want them. So in 1943, the Saturday Evening Post ran them in 4 consecutive issues, and they were so popular that the U.S. Treasury actually mounted an exhibition of the original paintings and eventually used them to sell their war bonds. So this was certainly in a time when the OWI didn't get things right. Okay, this is another collection I'm going to show you, and it's of the artist John Falter. And that's Falter in his later years in his studio. And this is a painting done for a Red Cross poster of a blind soldier and his daughter. John Falter was born in Plattsmouth, Nebraska in 1910. When he was 6, his family moved to Falls City, where his father established a clothing store. After graduating from high school in 1928, he studied at the Kansas City Art Institute and won a scholarship to the Art Students League in New York. He received his first commission from Liberty magazine to do 3 illustrations a week in 1933. During the 1930s, he became a successful illustrator of fiction, mainly pulp fiction. During the 1940s and 50s, he acquired several advertising clients, and they included Gulf Oil, Four Roses Whiskey, Arrow Shirts, Pall Mall, Johnson & Johnson, and Hertz Rent-A-Car. He entered the Navy in 1943 and was commissioned a lieutenant on special art assignments, and he did more than 300 recruiting posters and pamphlets. While in the Navy, he did a notable series also of 12 great war heroes that ran in Esquire magazine. In the 40s, Falter began to produce work for the Saturday Evening Post, and by the 1960s had created over 185 covers for them. In addition to the Post, Falter work could be found in Good Housekeeping, Reader's Digest, The Ladies' Home Journal, Cosmopolitan, Look, McCall's, and Life. In the 1960s, he did less and less commercial work and concentrated more on book illustrations and private commissions. During the 1970s and 1980s, Falter completed nearly 300 Western paintings dealing with American migration from the 1840s to the 1880s. Oops. He also did a series of 6 bicentennial paintings for the 3M Company. In the 1970s, he was elected to the Illustrators Hall of Fame and completed a series of sketches from life done at the Colorado Jazz Party and the Odessa, Texas Jazz Party. The drawings from the Colorado Party formed the basis of his 1971 Jazz from Life portfolio of prints. After his death in April 1982, his widow donated objects and furnishings from his studio, numerous paintings, papers, and sketchbooks to the society. This is from his collection, and it includes a clipping that he did in 1926 for the paper in Falls City. So this would be one of his very earliest pieces. And these are from sketchbooks. These are doodles. And what I like about these next 2 is he's a young person at this point, a young adult. He's obviously trying stuff out. And if you look, he's trying to figure out how he's going to sign his paintings, which I just think is really cool. This is a painting for a Four Roses whiskey ad. And if you go on eBay, you can purchase this ad. There's just a glut of Falter ads for sale. They're apparently very popular, but we have the original. These are some of his pulp fiction covers. And you can see his own little note on the bottom one, my last pulp cover. So maybe something to be proud of. Here's some more pulp. I like the pulp stuff. I think it's neat. But he did leave little notes. Like here he has the names of the models. There's some interesting stuff in these old magazines. And this is actually an original painting for an illustration for a story in Liberty magazine that was in 1934. It was called Hearts and Swords, and it was by Raphael Sabatini, who was quite well known and was a popular author of swashbuckling romance adventure type stories of the time. And this is a great collection because it shows a lot of times art from sort of the doodle stage to the completed stage, which I think is a really neat way to look at an artist's collection. And what's also great is Falter had this interesting habit of when he'd get the ad proofs back, he'd make really strange and funny comments in all of them. Because I think he knew what the picture was and sort of if it was going to be for Campbell's or Hertz, but he didn't know what the text would be, so he'd put these really crazy things in. And he said he just in the doodles I found on the copy, it said that the author was actually, I guess, a great fencer, and so really knew how people should be placed. And he had to do this painting like 3 or 4 times because he was not happy with how they were actually fighting in the scene. And here's another great one. This is in his writing. He said this little girl painting is the first illustration he did for a major U.S. magazine. That's for McCall's, and that's 1938. So Liberty magazine was not a great U.S. magazine, but McCall's was. So he had his standards there. And this is just another really neat illustration. I haven't been able to tie down what magazine it was for or what book it was for. And here are some ads for Campbell's Soup from 1936. And I think this is one of those times when he would do the picture but not know what they were going to say, because his next one is just a strange ad. Wife beaters. I'm not sure how you sell soup by calling people wife beaters, but and his caption was, "They sure look like it, don't they?" And this is a series, and I'm just showing these because I found this is really interesting. His Pall Mall series, very popular. I think he did probably 15 of these images, and all of them are of military men, occasionally women, usually in a combat area or deployed somewhere, and they're all comparing Pall Mall cigarettes. And apparently all our military people had to do at that time was to talk about something happening in the cigarette business. So it doesn't really relate to Falter, but I mean, these old magazines have some great stuff. And people will be saying that about our magazines 100 years from now. This is a painting called Prisoners, and it was one of his government posters. This is a poster he did for the Red Cross. Obviously, that's a really sweet piece. This is called the Jap Eradicator, and it is one that he did, I believe, for Esquire. This one is The Temptation of a Hero, the pilot Joe Foss. This was one of the Esquire pieces. Great painting. This is James P. Johnson, and this was from the Jazz for Life series. So we have another neat thing about this collection is we have the actual, life sketches he did while he was at the party, and then we have the actual the paintings, and then we have the portfolio of prints. And this I love, these sketchbooks of his. And this is, I don't know what this was used for, and I'd love to track it down. It's just a sweet, sweet little piece. And this, obviously he meant this for a post cover. This whole sketchbook is just filled with different images from this. So you've got different variations of the men standing and different buildings. You can see he's changed it a little bit here. So we still have the men standing, but instead of a church, we've got a house. And I don't know if, actually in the previous one, you've got a church and then they have a district school. So, they're going to, I guess, tear down the church for a school. Well, we changed it from that to here's a sweet house, and it turns into that. And that I just think is great, to sit there and look through the stuff and see it in all the stages and then what the final version is. So it looks like it's a highway taking over this picturesque house, which I actually believe is his house in Pennsylvania. So that's it for John Falter. The last series collection that I'm going to talk about is by Herbert Johnson, who I actually don't know a lot about and I'd like to learn more about because we have a lot of his stuff in our collection. What I do know is that he was born in Sutton, Nebraska, and he attended the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. He made a career out of drawing political cartoons, which I think in today's terms we would say were definitely of a right bent. He served as a cartoonist with the Denver Republican in 1896. He was head of the art and engraving departments at the Kansas City Journal from 1897 to 1899, and he worked as a freelance cartoonist in New York from 1903 to 1905. And he also worked for the Saturday Evening Post from 1912 until his retirement in 1941. Johnson, like Falter, went over to Pennsylvania, and he died there in 1946. All of these images are from the Saturday Evening Post. They are his finals, and I'll give you a minute to just absorb them. He has his captions handwritten on the bottom. This is an interesting one. It's one of those topics that people might think is new to today, but obviously isn't. Didn't seem to be very fond of New Deal or Roosevelt. This one's titled Disposing of It. And there's the New Dale merry-go-round. And this is one of his pieces that wasn't political, so I included it. And that is actually the end of my talk. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them for you. Yes?
At the very beginning, you talked about Oto Indians and Barnston.
Mm-hmm.
I just was trying to remember, I drove down that road a couple of months ago. Isn't that school the only remnant of some of that that had been there? Isn't there an old building, a church or a school or something you see from the highway?
I think so. Is that the Genoa Indian School? That's in Genoa. I'm not sure. I don't know. Does anybody else know? We could try and find out for you. Any other? Yes?
How do you decide to compile these things to ever put them on display? Because I don't think I've ever seen any of those in the museum. So how do you go about saying, okay, we're going to someday put these into some sort of display so we can see some of these treasures that are all put away?
Yeah. Well, there's a committee that works on developing an exhibit plan. And our exhibits are planned several years in advance. It would be great to get a lot of these on display. Sometimes we're limited by staff, how much, there's 2 people in our department, the collections department, how much we can put together. And then there are other people who work within the society who also want to present their stuff, so we need to give equal time. The Falter collection, which I would love to see made available almost in its entirety, either as an exhibit or online, actually is not fully cataloged, and that's sort of a staffing issue where we've had it for a while, but it's so exhaustive and large that it needs a lot of work, so we're continuing to do that sort of research. Same with the Johnson. We sometimes need help, staff help, or even volunteers to help us get through all of it so that we can make it available. I think, as we're trying to get more and more stuff digitized, at this point in the collections department, whenever we use anything or get anything, it's all digitized. We try to capture all the information immediately, that we hope to have a lot of this stuff that isn't necessarily on exhibit available at least through the web in some format. And additionally, and that could be helpful for some of these objects which are damaged by light and we don't want to leave out indefinitely. So, yes?
Is there going to be any interaction between you folks with your quilt collection and the new quilt center?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We're not competing in any way. They're international, and they collect for almost different reasons than we do. We collect for Nebraska history, and it's actually become a wonderful experience because we've done 2 quilt exhibits now in cooperation with them, where usually half of the quilts come from their collection and half from ours. And what's been nice is Carolyn, who's the curator over there, commonly will get quilts in that might not fit what they're looking for, but are great Nebraska quilts, and she sends them to us. And actually, our quilt donations have gone up significantly with their assistance. So I'm thrilled. Is that it? Well, thank you, and happy holidays to y'all.